Few films in cinematic history have presented a story as powerful and emotionally captivating as the horrifying and mysterious Frank Darabont 2007 Stephen King adaptation, The Mist. Exploring the viciously harrowing and equally traumatizing tale of David Drayton as he and his son, along with a collection of initially skeptical people inside a local store, discover the terrifyingly daunting and seemingly inescapable sights surrounding them, The Mist relentlessly drowns you in a story defined by its unsettling atrocities and horrors, questioning the nature of human psychology and corruptibility as it persistently and unceasingly escalates its terror throughout every scene before abruptly and catastrophically destroying even the last ember of human perseverance and hope you naively thought the film would leave you. The Mist's unnerving, heartbreaking, and at this point iconic conclusion is, without question, the film's most notorious moment. Known for its dark portrayal of the human psyche, showing both the characters and the audience's limited propensity for hope, and potential for enormous emotional collapse when faced with unstoppable danger and overwhelming fear. Which is why today, I'm going to give my take on why The Mist's ending works so well, and why I believe it's undoubtedly one of the greatest film endings ever made. So, without further ado,
shut the fuck up and listen.
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
We are in very serious trouble.
Look, Jeffrey Dahmer was eating the shit out of niggas' heads.
He is the one.
During an intense and heart-pounding escape highlighted by the climactic and deadly confrontation between David's desperate group of survivors and Mrs. Carmody's brainwashed collection of characters, David and his group hurriedly runs through the store attempting to reach his car, hoping that it will give them salvation both from the Mist's onslaught of unimaginably nightmarish creatures and from the increasingly hostile climate inside the store. Though I'm sure they understood far better than anyone watching the film that abandoning the safety of the store in favor of the unknown dangers in the Mist would probably put them in an even more precarious situation, just as it eventually does, I also realize how drastic and urgent a predicament these characters faced as a result of all of the horrible events they experienced. Bound to a mild state of insanity by the fear instilled into them by both the monsters of the Mist and Mrs. Carmody's psychologically corruptive preaching, the citizens inside the store displayed a level of depravity rarely seen in film with so much realism and weight to the story, visualizing how far fear and instability can push people, even to the point that they would not only consider forcibly separating a child from his father and sacrificing him, but also fully acting towards such a despicable act, justifying it with the unlikely possibility that it may save them. These scenes highlight how humans' mounting fears of death and the unknown can allow them to believe things they otherwise wouldn't even begin to think about, and justify them in ways they normally would have condemned. Eventually though, after finally exterminating the toxic plague that was Mrs. Carmody, the survivors finally and chaotically reached David's car, but only after having lost many of their friends as well, showing that although they may have had the moral superiority of the people left in the store, they had to give up their own safety to maintain it, alluding to the idea that sometimes, even when you do what's right, like refusing to sacrifice a child, you may still face a much harder, more deadly path than those around you, people who chose to operate within the comfort of their safety, even if it meant betraying their morals instead of stepping into unknown, unfamiliar, and possibly damaging territory, manifested in this case by a literal mist, and facing life-altering or threatening obstacles to uphold their morality and do the right thing. I tried telling some people from the store about this too, but you know how stubborn they can be sometimes. They just snidely dismissed what I had to say.
It's a pile of shit.
Of course it's a lie. Of course it's a lie. It's lunacy.
No, it's a lie, you know. I mean, all these people do is just line each other up.
But after having started their long endeavor into the Mist, unaware of its massive reach or what other monstrosities lie within it, David and his group finally returned to where the story began, completing a cycle that both started and ended at the Drayton residence, but saw a drastic change in tone for the characters and the audience, giving a visible representation of how much the Mist had altered everyone's lives forever. At David's house, they discover David's wife dead and covered in webs, as his guilt about what happened reveals the Mist's undiscriminating, forceful nature. Despite David's unwavering protectiveness towards his son and the audience's generally positive attitudes towards him, the Mist still overwhelms him emotionally through the pain and turmoil of those around him, rather than physically affecting David himself, something that echoes throughout the film, especially in its finale. We continue seeing this effect the Mist has on David as the survivors continue drifting through the Mist when they witness the school bus with dead children and the unbelievable, impossibly large monster, barely visible through the thick mist, walking around. Encountering something so powerful and unstoppable not only gives them and the audience an existential perspective on the nature of reality, allowing them to see just how small they are relative to the incredible and frightening reach of the mist and everything beyond it, but it also forces them to acknowledge the unlikelihood of their survival or rescue in their current circumstances.
We gave it a good shot. Nobody can say we didn't.
Fully understanding the magnitude of their hopeless situation, the 5 survivors collectively come to the difficult decision to commit suicide rather than face an almost certainly gruesome and torturous death by one or several of the creatures in the mist. Instead of ending the film with all 5 committing suicide though, which also would have made for an incredibly haunting and depressing finale, Darabont makes an even more disturbing choice by revealing that the 5 survivors only have 4 bullets left, meaning that someone would have to survive, and showing that these characters believe death would be preferable to isolation in the mist, which adds to the scene's sense of hopelessness and horror, because being a survivor of a situation as catastrophic as the mist would typically be sought after, but here they treat it more like a disease, something to avoid. After having killed the other 4 survivors, including his young son, a bloody David desperately tries to kill himself, repeatedly but pointlessly pulling the trigger, overcome by unfathomable emotion before calling out to the creatures of the mist to come for him, further reinforcing the idea that at this point, survival in the mist and many other horrific environments, even those in real life, can be so painful and traumatic that many people turn to suicide to escape and relieve themselves of the harrowing memories that haunt them. In David's case, the seemingly merciful yet heartbreaking and emotionally heavy task of killing 4 people is rewarded not with the expected result of salvation from the mist's apparently endless number of mystifying and horrific creatures covered with
tentacles from Planet X,
but instead with an incomprehensibly guilty conscience and an irreversibly depressed and sorrowful mind. But before the film finishes completely, as David hopelessly screams and begs the creatures of the mist to come for him to absolve him of his unforgivable actions, the atmospheric sounds that had become synonymous with the mist begin subtly changing as the mist slowly starts clearing up, releasing David from a grisly death at the hands of some atrocious creature, but the discovery of a rescue team only worsens David's resolve because of what he had done just a few moments earlier. David wanted to die after having mercilessly but still painfully killed 4 people, including his only child, but realizing that he had done so just before help arrived was a nightmare worse than he could imagine, even after all of the tragedies he had been through. Isn't that right, Brent?
I'm sorry, I'm just not that stupid. I mean, what do you take me for? I'm shocked. I'm shocked.
Well, damn, Brent. I just wanted to know what you thought. You didn't have to be so patronizing about it. Jeez.
No, we got real problems to deal with here, and this pathetic attempt at a joke has gone far enough.
Okay, fine, but you didn't have to be so damn mean about it. Perhaps the most disheartening aspect of the film's finale, and maybe even the entire movie, comes during David's realization that the woman, let's call her Carol, who had previously left the protection of the store alone after nobody else would go with her in search of her kids, somehow, despite the seemingly impossible odds, not only survived, but also found her children and made it to safety. Despite what happened to the biker, Private Jessup, and nearly everyone else who ventured into the mist, Carol, a lone woman without any weapons or anything else that might have helped her on such a dangerous journey, mysteriously overcame the unfathomable horrors in the mist. But how? Well, perhaps the mist let Carol survive, knowing that David would eventually commit his most unforgivable act, and it wanted to emotionally break David to his core, to so completely destroy him that he could never recover. Back in the film's introduction, when Carol decided to go into the mist alone, David made the right choice by staying in the store with his son, but it didn't matter. Regardless of the choices he made, David would lose his sanity to the mist, and everything he experienced throughout the film continued chipping away at his psyche until the painful final blows completely overwhelmed him. In only a brief moment, the juxtaposition of Carol and David, who, at this point, despite the relatively close physical distance, had an enormous emotional chasm between them, with David having committed one of the most inhuman acts for the sake of mercy, dreadfully shows how low David had fallen, represented when he literally drops to his knees in agony. Whereas Carol's survival was miraculous, represented in her relatively high position, David's survival was malicious due to the horrors he endured. The mist allowed Carol to not only survive herself, but also find and save her children while manipulating David into doing the opposite, so that it would finally and totally break him once he saw her, his last push into insanity. This idea that the mist seems to specifically target David emotionally and psychologically rather than physically, as it does most of the other main characters, culminates in these final few moments as he surprisingly survives the mist in a way that usually would be seen as miraculous and impossible, but in this case, with all of the horrifying and traumatizing events that had unfolded earlier, this moment couldn't be more unsettling and disheartening. In most films, when the hero survives a seemingly impossible situation, they appear grateful to be alive, happy to have lived through something so horrific and unbearable. But in The Mist, David's survival is a curse rather than a blessing. Whereas The Mist affects most of the characters physically, whether it causes them to be burned alive or cut in half or impregnated by hundreds of spiders, it destroys David's mind, culminating in the film's final few moments after breaking David so completely that he can do nothing but cry. The Mist's conclusion reveals that one's own death isn't always the worst outcome. Seeing those you care for suffer while being powerless to stop it is sometimes far worse and even more heartbreaking.
What if you're wrong?
Then I guess the joke would be on me, after all.